What are the neural mechanisms in spatial memory?
Yeah, spatial memory is a big area. Inside your brain is a bit of the brain called the parietal cortex. It does a wonderful job of organizing the structure of the world out there. So it's building what we might describe as an internal model, an understanding of what is out there. If you're trying to think about who knows who, does Bob know Sue? Does Sue know? It's likely you're using the same systems to kind of map the structure of your social network. So in the last year, scientists have really seen a lot of nice evidence that our brain doesn't just map space with these systems. It maps anything it can map in terms of abstract structures, including language.
I'm curious, what's correlated with spatial navigation? What things can you predict with that information?
There are things that might be more likely if you're a worse navigator. Some people really struggle, some struggle a bit, some are fine, and some are really like super navigators. Licensed London taxi drivers, the ones that drive the black cabs, they tend to have a larger posterior hippocampus. So that's a very particular group of people though, who are super navigators. And are trained and spend every day navigating. If you suffer damage to cross your entire hippocampus, you won't be able to find your way in new places. You'll never learn to find your way going into a new building. But curiously, you will for old places you went to many years ago. The hippocampus kind of backs up these maps into other bits of the brain. But where exactly? That's been a bit of a mystery.
One of the things that they say is if you're taking a test, that it's good to study in the place that you're going to take the test, that your memory is linked again to those spatial maps in some way. Is there truth to that?
Yeah, there's been quite a lot of studies showing what's called the reactivation of the context. So context can be many things. So I think with the triathlon and watching a movie of the path is you're actually giving your brain a boost, like it's going to have to need less energy in the future to put the pieces together. And so you're actually giving yourself more of a chance to get ready and to build all the connections in your brain that are needed to help you compete in that triathlon.
What are you most scared of in the next decade?
There's not a human-operated drone anymore. It's a neural network running a drone that is delivering a payload to destroy an infrastructure setting and likely killing people. There's an escalation here. It's a natural progression, but it's just a bit, I think one of the scary things that's happening in the world is automated drones. Having your independence and your capacity to find your way is potentially life-saving. There are people who've lost their way, didn't really learn how to navigate. There are terrible stories of people who didn't.
Dr. Hugo Spiers is a cognitive neuroscientist from King's College London, and he has spent over 25 years studying our spatial navigation system within the brain. He has published over 160 different research papers on the neural mechanisms behind our spatial navigation, how we move from one place to another. We do it so seamlessly, but the system that underlies it is remarkably beautiful. I learned personal things on this podcast about what my awful sense of direction means for me and my brain, and honestly, I've never learned so much within one of these podcasts. I gained an appreciation for why I should actually try to improve this system in the brain and not just rely on Google Maps the entire time. If you don't want to miss out on a neuroscience podcast where I'm speaking to the brightest neuroscience researchers and communicators all over the world, then subscribe on YouTube and follow on Spotify. I promise the episodes are only going to get better from here, and it really supports the channel. Thank you so much, and enjoy the episode. Dr. Hugo Spiers, thank you so much for joining me. You study the neuroscience of spatial navigation. I have the worst sense of direction of anyone I've ever met. And it's hard to say that because I hate admitting I'm bad at anything, but I genuinely have a really bad sense of direction. What does that say about me? What does that say about my brain?
I would say you're one of many, many people. Like your brain's very much one of the normal brains out there. There's a lot of people who really struggle to find their way. As you say, like people, it varies. Some people really struggle. Some struggle a bit. Some are fine. Some are really like super navigators. So what it exactly says about I can't tell you anything about, your brain will have some large bit here, or it's working in a very particular way. We don't know that information. There's a lot we don't know as scientists to answer that question, actually. We're still in the dark a bit. But yeah, I'm not fantastic. I'm probably pretty medium navigator, but the errors I think are fun. Like the kind of problems that present themselves when you're trying to find your way are worth thinking about what they tell us about being human and living in this world.
Yeah. So I asked because I was curious what things are correlated with that data. So you couldn't tell with any degree of certainty or any statistical significance that I have a smaller hippocampus or my probability that I'll lose my items. I'm curious what's correlated with spatial navigation. What things can you predict
That's
with that information?
Yeah, that's true. I think you caught me there on that one. So you're right. There are things that might be more likely if you're a worse navigator, and yeah, whereas it's hard to predict. All these things are sort of weak correlations. They're not as strong. You will be this or so. We're beginning to unpack that. There is varied evidence for the involvement of brain structure. So there are a number of studies that say yes, for example, having a larger hippocampus, or top part of your hippocampus, this key bit of the brain deep in our head called the hippocampus, that having a larger one of these would be good for navigating. That there's more brain cells, or the way they're organized, they're larger, would be good. And certainly one of the driving parts of that story is the fact that many years ago, licensed London taxi drivers, the ones that drive the black cabs in London, they tend to have a larger posterior hippocampus, and that was a finding made by Eleanor Maguire back in 2000, 24 years ago. That's been replicated in a number of studies since. So it's not a one-off finding. It's been shown 3 times, and in fact 4 times. So that's a very particular group of people though who are super navigators, and have trained and spent every day navigating. But on the other hand, there are some studies that just say all of us, like you and me, who aren't experts, there is a relationship between the size of our hippocampus and navigation. But there are other studies that say forget it. Like with a large sample, we don't see anything at all. So it's a bit the jury's not in on that one. Like it may be in for experts, but for
Interesting.
other people, it's not.
Interesting. Yeah, the London cab driver, for anyone who's studied sort of neuroscience or psychology, that's kind of a famous experiment. I remember one of the doubts, and I'm curious has it been elucidated at all with that study, is they didn't really know the order of causality or the order of correlation. Does it happen to be that people that have larger hippocampuses and have an innate ability to have better spatial navigation are more prone to become cab drivers, or did flexing that muscle again and again and again by memorizing the different streets actually cause the increase? Do we know anything more about that now?
Yeah, there's a really nice study tackling that. So this was a study in 2011, so now, a decade ago, looking at people who want to become London taxi drivers. So this is a study by Katia Willett and Eleanor Maguire, published in Current Biology, and it's a really nice study where they took a group of people who wanted to become taxi drivers in London and people who didn't, and they scanned them before they started training and after. And this is 2 to 4 years later. It takes so long to memorize London. So people that don't know this with London taxi drivers, the ones who get the license to operate freely, they have to memorize like 26,000 street names to sit an exam where they're just given 2 streets and they have to tell the examiner every single street they would go through to get between these 2 points. And if they don't give the right streets, they're sent away. And my understanding last time I spoke to drivers is about 16 times you fail that exam before you get awarded. And a lot of people don't make it. They just cannot remember that many streets. So the first thing that this is Katia Willett and Eleanor Maguire found, was that there were no big size differences between the people wanting to become drivers and those who did, the ones who did and didn't. And so that suggests that at the
Interesting.
start they don't have the answer to your question. There's something causal about the training. The next thing that made the paper even more publishable was that 2 to 4 years later, the ones who passed the exam and were now operating as London taxi drivers, they had a larger posterior hippocampus. They were the very sort of key bit of this bit of the brain than the people who had not trained. And another key feature was that the people who hadn't done any training, there's just no difference. So their hippocampus was very stable in that period. It didn't change in size. It was very, very stable. But there was a substantial increase in this particular small bit of the hippocampus that increased. And that's not the end of the story, because that kind of answers that. It does look like from that data that it's the training that's important. But the nicest bit of the paper for me was this group of people who'd signed up to become taxi drivers, who also, like the ones who passed and who didn't bother, had the same size brain at the start. hippocampus specifically. But there was no change in their brain 2 to 4 years later after trying and training when they failed. So what that says is not the taking part that matters, it's the winning, in a sense, the reverse of the standard story you're told. If you want to radically change the size of your posterior hippocampus, you needed to have done it in such a way you could pass that grueling exam. But if you didn't pass it, then you're not going to. So, they could change that exam and take an MRI scan in theory to decide whether you have done all the homework and done it right. But that's expensive running MRI scans.
Yeah, interesting. I'm happy that that was a brilliant answer to it, because that seems like a question that's been well and truly answered. Do we know if this enlarged posterior hippocampus confers any other benefits? I'm curious how that relates to spatial navigation, or sort of outside of cognitive domains, outside of spatial navigation. If you're really strong in that area, do we know if it confers any other benefits?
No, it's a really good question. We don't. From that work done, there's a number of nice studies done by Eleanor McGuire's team, particularly Katia Willett, looking at these taxi drivers. My memory is they were better able to integrate new learning they were able to better learn new routes. And we've been looking at that. So I worked with Eleanor McGuire studying taxi drivers back to the 2000s as well. And yeah, they were better able to learn new routes. And more recently in my own lab, we've been looking at how they might do well in a standardized test on a video game that would test their navigation. And looks like there's real advantages to that training, but that's within their domain. So they're good at navigating. But we haven't seen so much on the kind of, are they good at other things? And that's a really interesting question. So we don't know the answer to that. The reverse is kind of true, though. So it turned out that in the early studies that were run, they were actually worse at remembering a story than control participants. So there's almost like a disadvantage to becoming an absolute expert at navigating. But it's important to recognize for any taxi driver that might be listening to this, it's like a tiny difference. It's not like it's a big whopping, terrible at remembering stories. They're very much within the normal range. It's just there's a slight disadvantage for remembering stories.
Interesting.
Yeah. No, I found it very interesting, this effect. So the other thing we were curious in that past work was whether the changes that you see in the brain for the taxi drivers, is it actually the memorizing it, or is it the driving around London in the pollution and all the rest of it, dealing with customers,
yes,
exposure to a big city over time, or it's just sitting still. You're having to sit behind a wheel, and it might change your brain compared to someone that doesn't do that. And so to tackle that, we compared the licensed London taxi drivers to bus drivers. Because bus drivers, same thing. They drive around London all the time, deal with customers, sitting, looking at the world go by, aren't getting that physically active. And there was no different, there was nothing special about bus drivers' brains. The taxi drivers had consistently bigger posterior hippocampi than the bus drivers. So it doesn't look like it's just sitting in a car driving around in a city. You need to be using your brain to change that part. Yeah.
Yeah. So interesting. And do you think that I'm curious on your intuition on the slight worsening in their ability to memorize stories. Do you think that there's there's a general principle in the brain that if you don't use a particular module, that other areas will start wiring into it, right? It's a conquering world in the brain where it will try and expand its territory. So do you think that could be due to, the spatial navigation memory system sort of encroaching on those other memory areas and sort of taking over neuronal real estate kind of? Would that be a possible mechanism for how that would work?
I think that's quite an interesting way of looking at it. I'd be being a scientist, I'd be much more cautious about framing it like that. So I wouldn't go down the route of framing it in quite that way. So what I think was important in that data was that the anterior hippocampus, so the hippocampus lies it's kind of like, it gets its name from looking a bit like a seahorse. And there's kind of one on each side of your brain. Your brain has two hemispheres, and there's one on each side. And it has a bit towards the back and a bit towards the front. And it was that more anterior frontal bit that was actually slightly smaller in London taxi drivers. And so we wondered whether that was the reason why they're slightly worse at stories. But there wasn't a nice correlation and frustratingly between the size of that and how well they did on stories. But it does make some sense that the brain, it appears, does seem to reorganize. So it's not that the taxi drivers' brains don't just get bigger and bigger and, like, they're getting crushed inside their skulls. Not at all. We're talking about very
Yeah.
small differences, but potentially visible differences. But it isn't a kind of just the hippocampus. It seems to reorganize it. Whether that is neural real estate, being shifted around to solve that, we don't know. It's an interesting speculation. I don't think it's a crazy thing at all to ask. It's a good question, but actually answering that, to say that, so it's a little bit harder to be confident that's what's happening. But there's certainly some interesting reorganization going on. And we recently, in the last few years, recorded using MRI the brains of a whole group of London taxi drivers, and we're still picking our way through to really look at their brains in detail now in 2024, where the imaging data is a lot more detailed. But we're still working our way through that data, so I don't have anything I can tell you right now on that, but I hope to in the future.
Yeah, it's really interesting. What are the actual neuromechanisms? Let's try and lay out a general framework for people listening to this. What are the neural mechanisms in spatial memory?
Yeah, spatial memory is a big area. So there are bits of the brain that do things, and there's spatial memory. So, you can think about where are things sitting at your desk. Where did you leave your cup, when you reach for a cup of coffee at your desk? And there's certain bits of the brain. So just above at the back of your head is a bit of the brain. Underneath your skull, inside your brain, is a bit of the brain called the parietal cortex. And it does a wonderful job of organizing the structure of the world out there. So it's building what we might describe as an internal model, an understanding of what is out there and where are things. So when you're just reaching for stuff around, it's carrying that, and it's doing a magical job of allowing you to do that. And it also helps when you're going out when you leave your front door and you go somewhere. You go out to visit someone, a friend, or you're traveling somewhere. It will help you think about where the space is in terms of things going from your body. It's not just the cups you can reach, but the fact I need to go down here and turn right. How am I going to move through this space in terms of my body? And that's one key thing we need to do when we're navigating or remembering where things are. And that's called egocentric processing, because it's all about me, my body reference, right? But there are other bits of the brain, and in particular one we've just been discussing, the hippocampus, that seem to be particularly specialized for what we call allocentric processing, which allocentric means other-centered. So in the case of the hippocampus, that's kind of like, where are things to north? Not magnetic north, but where your brain has decided there's kind of like a general big direction. So if you're living in London, like, there's a kind of access to a lot of the streets, and your brain will have cottoned onto that, and it can think about where things are in terms of the environment. And so when we're remembering where things are or finding our way, we'll be using these two different systems and translating between them. So just to take an example, you're thinking, I need to get to, say, King's Cross Station in London. It's possible to kind of both imagine a map you could see, but inside your head, not to do with a visual map, but what we as scientists would call a cognitive map, retrieve information inside your head from that one word, King's Cross Station, to retrieve that from a map-like system that knows where it is north of you, if you happen to be south of King's Cross, and determine where you are and where that is. And then it would need to convert that information from a map-like state into, what do I need to actually do to walk there? I don't want to go north. I could walk backwards all the way to King's Cross Station, but that's not very efficient. I'm likely to get run over. So I need to make sure my body's going in the right direction. So there's really, at the heart of thinking about spatial memory and spatial systems, is this idea of our brain does this magical job of integrating a kind of map-like world out there and an egocentric me-based perspective into it. But there are lots of other, and on top of those two kind of interacting systems, there are systems for kind of making habits. So when I go to the shops or somewhere like locally, I don't want to think about it, as in it's exhausting my brain using energy. I've done it loads of times. There are some fantastic kind of autopilot-like systems that once I've latched onto a destination will automate what I need to do to get there. And without it, life would be quite exhausting. Having to think, where is my fridge? Oh, it's there. And how do I get to my fridge at my house? It would burn your brain for these a lot of glucose. So our brain has these things, and that tends to be the striatum, another key part of this navigation circuit. But they all get co-opted. So the bits I've talked about for navigating, if you're trying to think about how all your friends are related, who knows who? Does Bob know Sue? Does Sue know? It's likely you're using the same systems to kind of map the structure of your social network or some aspect of knowledge if you're learning things. So in the last year, scientists have really seen a lot of nice evidence that our brain doesn't just map space with these systems. It maps anything it can map in terms of abstract structures, including language. So how different words are related in a kind of word space appears to be, using the same kind of mapping systems. So there's been quite a novel, exciting avenue for research.
It's very interesting. And how do these, it's an interesting point on the autopilot because I've never associated those autopilot circuits with a destination. I've never connected that where if your brain knows you're going to the shop, for some reason that mental map is able to link in with all these other cognitive modules, which are, all the other activities that are required in figuring out what you want for lunch and figuring out what you want for dinner, but it's like intimately linked to the mental map. So the mental map communicates and interplays with all of these other cognitive modules in a very synergistic way.
Yeah, exactly. And you just underestimate. I think it's worth being aware as well. I think there are like three levels of things that go on. So there's the kind of full map when you are puzzling over how I could get to somewhere I know. Like, what's the best way I could get there? Someone would say, should we go this way or that way? That's likely when you're using the hippocampus in this system to find your way. Or you've just recently gone, like you're on holiday somewhere new and you're trying to figure it all out. Then you need this quite elaborate system. As soon as it's really familiar and you've taken that route many times, it seems like the striatum, these other brain regions, do the autopilot. But then there's a third system, which is just kind of latching onto what is generally good. Right? So the autopilot to distort, if you're in an airplane, the autopilot needs a destination, like you said. So it is actually kind of what we describe as scientists as goal directed. It needs a goal to latch onto.
Yeah.
But there are other kind of habits that are not goal directed, that are just when you step out of your house, let's say, you more often go left up the street or whatever. There'll be part of your brain that just has that ready to go as a repertoire that's not goal directed. And so it's frustrating if your goal is to go to the other direction. You have to compete with these. So the autopilot is actually competing with something else, like an over reinforced, we would describe, system. And so there's all these three things going on at least, and possibly more, that you could be thinking in terms of a map of the world, running a kind of clever autopilot, and then just your really overexposed habits. And so
Yeah.
this is all what makes us efficient in the world. We evolved these systems because they work really well.
It's incredibly interesting. I remember my first day of college because I stepped out from the train station and I walked directly to my previous school but both the college and my school were in Dublin City and I lived about 45 minutes outside of Dublin. So I got the same train in. And somehow my first day I just autopilot walked the opposite way from the college and just, completely on autopilot walked to the school. And I only realized it when I literally got to the door and I was like, how did I just do that? That's like 15 minutes of walking the wrong direction. I don't know how zonked out I was or thinking about something else, but that just proves how much on autopilot we can go. I'm curious how these mental and cognitive maps, how do they physically resemble the world? Like their physical shape. How closely do they actually show what exists in the real world?
Yeah, that's a lovely question with quite a complicated answer. I'll do my best to, because it took me years after reading this research to really understand what's going on, and I'll try and do my best. And I think it's fascinating. So, um, it might be worth thinking about the fact that your brain already carries a lot of maps inside it. So there's kind of a map of our whole body surface inside just the top of your head, and the kind of brain in the neocortex, which is the sort of stuff you see if you look at brains from the outside. It kind of maps like there's a bit of my arm here and shoulder. There are different cells and are organized nicely in kind of like a row linked to the arm cell, will be near the hand cells, and the shoulder cells near the neck cells. And it's an organized, what we call topographic map of space. When it comes to that mental map of the space, you can just see how ludicrous that would be if you were traveling the world. If you think of Michael Palin, who's like explored all these different places, been all over the planet, his brain would just be running out of space, right? That neural real estate you talked about. So it doesn't work like that at all. What appears to be the case is in the hippocampus, this bit that contains the map-like cells, um, you have each of these individual cells that can be active. So one of the key fundamentals of this in the brain is that the neurons will communicate, the brain cells will communicate with each other by sending bursts of information, which we call action potentials, where scientists talk about them firing, their firing activity. And so what this system seems to operate by is a kind of "you are here" signal. So there's a vast number of these cells that can be active at any moment. So the combination of that vast number of cells as to which cells can be active is far greater than the number of stars in the universe. It's this huge, huge combination. What you can then do with a system like that is if each cell can get excited in different places. So I'm sitting here at my desk now. There will be a whole host of cells inside my hippocampus that are very excited, sending out signals saying, "You're here, you're here. This is a place I like." But that combination of cells that are active where I'm sitting now is wholly distinct from even leaving this room and going into the corridor. A new population of brain cells will get excited there as I walk down the corridor. Everywhere I go, it's a bit like, you can imagine a combination lock. All the numbers in the combination lock can spin around, and every single place I go, I have a unique combination lock code for that place. And each of the individual cells that do that are called place cells. They're discovered by John O'Keefe and Jonathan Dostrowski. And John O'Keefe, who was at University College London, he went on to win the Nobel Prize with two other people for this incredible discovery that these place cells exist in the hippocampus. So the answer to that question of like our brain contains a map, and it's a bit like it's this sort of system that contains a vast number of cells that can get excited in different places. And it means you're never going to run out of places you could go. But you know, which ones are active where, it just appears to be random. So if I've never been to Ethiopia and I go there, I'll start using cells I've used all my life. But everywhere I go, will generate a new unique code for bits of each different step I might take through Ethiopia. And when I return there 10 years later, it could be the same cells or some set that again get active in my brain. And when I dream about Ethiopia, same cells. And so it's a really amazing system. But that's a kind of one of the ways in which our brain seems to map space.
Yeah. So it's super interesting. So the place cells that tell you you're at your desk, are those physically right beside the place cells that are your corridor place cells, and then they're right beside your kitchen place cells, like within your say an environment that you are very familiar with, your own house? Does it resemble the structure at all?
Not at all. That's exactly it. That seems to go against, like it's purely random in an amazing way. So what I mean by that is, like, so say there are 500 cells that are active now where I'm down. It's probably much more than that, but say there's 500 cells. It may be that I have in those 500 cells for this desk when I'm sitting there, 5 of those cells also love the Eiffel Tower. Like when I'm standing at the Eiffel Tower, they're active there. But there's another 5 that, like, say, are excited at the Acropolis in Athens when I was there, you know. And so they can completely overlap with each other, and there's no coordination as to, you know, oh, these are both famous monuments. Maybe there's some similarity. No, it really is very helpful. And if you start thinking about how would these work, as I said, they're kind of like a "you are here" signal. Each combination of cells tells you something. As I move, though, there is some link. You know, the cells, you know, do merge from one cell being active to another, so you can build together sequences. So say I want to learn a route to the shop. Say I move into a new house, I need to learn a new route to the shops. As I go to the shops, there's a sequence of cells that are active as I make my way there because of the hippocampus liking different places at each point. And you can chain those together, so I can recall the route by reactivating later. I'm thinking about it, puzzling over where did I go. The idea is that you can reactivate that sequence of cells that could tell you which way to go. But as I've said, like, quite quickly our brain shifts into autopilot, so you don't need to spend your energy doing that. But it's how we can do quite clever things.
You brought up an interesting point, which was these "you are here" signals might have something to do with telling your body you're safe. Do you think is that one of the primary reasons of what these circuits are doing, is that they're signaling a familiarity so that you can almost go on autopilot? Because it would be a bad idea to put you on autopilot in a new location. right? That you want to be awake, you want your senses to be awake to potential dangers.
Yeah, that those are kind of questions that are really exciting, and actually we don't have full answers to. There's so much we still don't know. So the kind of thinking, as far as I'm aware of the field, is that you could learn, if you've got those cells, if they are sending signals to other bits of the brain and saying, this is an important place. You're currently in this place, and you're also getting a signal saying this is a terrifying place, because there are other bits of your brain to do with fear. And you combine those signals, it will allow your brain to learn this is a fearful place. I must avoid it. And the system can even kind of activate your recent memory of what route you took there to kind of add in that, which is the kind of impressive thing our brain does when we're maybe sleeping, is it can reactivate memories and then help build in, not just this one room was bad, but the journey to it, the surrounding experience was also useful to remember that it was dangerous. And again, the other way around, for safety, for good outcomes, you might want to learn that these cells that group of cells active is good. But to feed into it, what appears to be the case is that that map of where you are stays pretty pure. So it doesn't, the cells themselves that are telling you where you are, in many circumstances, aren't that modulated by, so if it's a fearful place, they're not more active. They're just telling you you're here, right? There are other cells that are doing the terror, and other cells that are connecting the terror with the place. But you kind of fundamentally need a raw map of space to help you understand. So that map gets biased and distorted in all sorts of ways, but there's a fundamental way in which our brain just, kind of maps space in a more pure way.
Makes sense. So it's really a holistic brain property then. It's not limited to a particular region. These maps spread from one end of the cortex all the way to the other, to the deeper subcortical regions, or just cortex, or explain where they're positioned and where they.
Yeah, that. So if we'd had this call maybe 5 years ago or a little lot longer, the answer would have been, wow, this map is very definitively in the hippocampus. That map of space that allows you to tell you where you are. It's there, and you don't see it in other bits. Since then, in the last years, quite a number of research teams have said, oh, yeah, we can see that kind of activity patterns in this area, that area, spread around in different bits of the brain. And to what extent they are really doing that, I think, is a lot of investigation as to whether you can get place-like signals or map-like. To what extent are they really? So if you're getting a map-like signal in bits of the brain to do with visual processing, when it goes dark, are they still there? Because in the hippocampus, those cells, the cells that light my desk, don't care whether I'm actually sitting here seeing things. It's if I'm thinking about being at my desk, and in the pitch black dark, if I know I'm at my desk, they're still active. But there are other maps in our brain that appear to be like that, but just are probably related a bit to what we can see and do. So the story has got a lot more complicated in the last years. But it isn't the case that there's just maps sort of echoing all around our brain. It seems that there are core bits of our brain that if you damage them, so the hippocampus is one, you will not, if you suffer damage to cross your entire hippocampus, you won't be able to find your way in new places at all. You'll never learn to find your way going into a new building. But curiously, you will for old places you went to many years ago. So what that's told us is that the hippocampus kind of backs up these maps into other bits of the brain. But where exactly? That's been a bit of a mystery. So I've done some work to try and find out where, but it's still early days, really, I think, with that.
So still a very active area of research. I'm interested in hearing if you saw. So recently, a couple of weeks ago, I can't remember the name of the lab, but they modeled a millimeter cubed of brain tissue to the highest resolution that has ever been modeled, 1,400,000 gigabytes. And I was reading the paper, and one of the discoveries they found there was that there was a group of directionally oriented neurons really deep into the subcortical area. And it's my understanding, now correct me if I'm wrong, that directionally oriented neurons usually have something to do with navigation or space. So like the hippocampal place cells are what's called directionally oriented. Please correct me if any of this is mistaken. But have you heard that? Did you hear that this was the first time they had really found these?
No, I need to look at that. I was aware there was this amazing mapping being done, but I didn't get that full detail. So that is another area. I would have said from my experience of reading the literature and work in the field that the cells that are doing, say, directional like coding of like what orientation I have in space, am I facing north or south? And I don't mean that in terms of magnetic sense, just the kind of sense of I know I'm in the, you know, I'm in this part of town facing uphill or wherever I'm looking. These directionally oriented cells don't seem to be oriented in a particular way in terms of the brain structure in some unique way. So there's not a link between the physical structuring of the cells and what their function is. That seems to be quite separate. The hippocampus has this beautiful layered structure to it. So there's some fascinating patterns within the way it's laid out, but they're not really related to the way it codes space externally. So the big difference between brain structure and layout and how we represent the layout of the world.
Brilliant. Well, that corrects a misnomer that I had in my head. Then so that's always good. That's why I do this is to learn. Um, I'm curious. One of the things that they say, and I don't know if there's any truth to it, is if you're taking a test, that it's good to study in the place that you're going to take the test. That your memory is linked again to those spatial maps in some way. Is there truth to that?
Yeah, there's been quite a lot of studies showing what's called that you've got this. Well, there's lots of ways describing that, but the key way is this reactivation of the context. So context can be many things. What context did you learn things in? But one of the most powerful contexts is where were you? So the classic study, one of the key discoveries around this was by the famous psychologist Alan Badley, and he was looking at divers going underwater and learning things or learning things on land, and showing this change in experience of being underwater profoundly affected their ability to remember things, in the sense of they're really good remembering things they learned underwater, but on land when they came back it was less good. And so it's this context shift. And one way of looking at it, what's happening inside our brain, is that when you learn things, they can get lodged into lots of other things. We automatically record in our brain. Like if you go to someone's birthday party, your brain will lay down, if it's a really great party and remember it later, it will store things about who was where. Like, wow, oh, we came in, they were on the. I mean, you might not remember distinctly if you had to describe it, but if someone said, "Was Daisy your friend always in the garden?" you'd be like, "No, she was definitely not in the garden the whole time." So you would know all sorts of things about a memory from years ago. And that's this kind of way our brain codes all this information. So when you think about studying for a test, it's like, well, it's also adding that information is being added with the information you're trying to memorize. And so when you go and kind of like try and get it back out again, then yeah, it's you've got a boost basically by the context is coming with it. So yeah, it's a well-known effect. This sort of testing context can transfer and aid retrieval.
Yeah. And is that a similar mechanism, or are you aware if it's a similar mechanism to when athletes try and visualize themselves in a mental space? So I've been training a lot for triathlons recently, and one of the things that they advise triathletes to do is to look at the course, to
Mm.
gain familiarity of the course, try and actually embody themselves there, obviously without having visited it, just look at video and really try and imagine yourself there. It will increase your familiarity on race day, just make you feel more comfortable. I'm curious, is that a similar mechanism?
Yeah, that is. So it's similar and it's different. So you're right to ask, like, oh, that's interesting, because if you think about that, if you've got that prior exposure and that knowledge about it, when you go to that place, so watching the videos of the course, and then when you actually go there, your brain's gathered some information it can retrieve at that point. So you've got this transfer to recall stuff that's, again, like the context is there. But what you're actually doing on one level is, you're building up knowledge about this future thing you want to do. And all of that knowledge in theory will help you. And like you said, it's kind of surprising that you should just train. Surely you just need to do that. And it's like darts players. The one I found really surprising, people that play darts, is imagining playing and hitting the board. It's a super physical, like getting the throw of the dart, but apparently simulating it in their head, like imagining it, benefits these expert dart players, or I've certainly heard that. And again, lots of sports, there's this visualization practice when you're not physically doing it. Um, and part of the description I've heard from sort of how people think about it is that your brain can kind of take that offline, in a sense, when you're not actively doing that, and use it to improve the kind of smoothness of those movements. And it is a surprise, but it does seem to be beneficial. How beneficial I suspect it's not beneficial for everyone in every context, but in many it does appear to be the case. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Do we have any idea of the mechanism? How exactly is the map, the navigational map, interacting with the motor cortex and
Mm.
tuning those neurons in those motor circuits just a little bit more consolidated? Do we know how those link up?
I think that bit, I could be wrong. There might be some really nice work out there, but I've not seen anything that really links the whole circuit together to say how does that imagination go down to the. Part of that is the challenge of recording those cells in humans, because we were talking about humans doing the simulate. You can't ask other animals to do that. So getting at the detail that you'd want to have is probably lacking. But I suspect people have recorded how activations in bits of the brain from various non-invasive methods like brain scanning are kind of shown that you are activating these when you simulate. I mean, certainly that kind of imagining throwing something, you will activate bits of your brain associated with the actual act that happens when you throw things. So we think about mental imagery as like, oh, I'm imagining I can see this thing, my brain replaying something inside my head. But it's also true that the control systems that allow you to move can get kind of activated in imagery. So that's kind of why the mechanism why this works. But I think you're also, when you're doing that kind of pre-workup, so I think with the triathlon and watching a movie of the path, is you're actually giving your brain a boost. Like it's going to have to need less energy in the future to put the pieces together. And so you're actually giving
Ah.
yourself more of a chance to get ready, not and to build all the connections in your brain that are needed to help you compete that in that triathlon, if that makes sense.
That
So
makes a
it's not
lot of sense.
just this
See,
kind of simulating, but you're actually building stuff in your head that is going to turn out useful.
so you're sort of preloading work that your brain has to do, again, to probably related to figuring out is your environment safe. And then because of that extra work and energy that you saved, you're just able to physiologically put more into the physical effort. Your brain is able to focus more on just physical performance on the day.
Potentially, I would say that, yeah, that's potentially the case, and it's always hard, like, because I'm a scientist here, so I have to be a bit more guarded about what like whether that's true. But that seems like
Yeah.
a reasonable assumption about what might well be happening is that you're prepping the system. Yeah.
Super interesting. I love that. What are the genetic components of spatial navigation? Is it having a good sense of direction genetic at all?
So there's a number of studies that have tried to look at kind of genetic factors that might relate to performance. And those haven't been typically huge studies. So when you get at genetics questions, that you tend to need large groups of participants to genetically screen. So there's kind of two ways that have been looked at that I think are interesting. There's lots of studies, but two ways I think are interesting. One of the kind of genetics where it's known that this genetic variation is associated with later outcomes. So a classic one is the ApoE gene, this particular or ApoE epsilon gene, which comes in two varieties, or three actually. So you can have these different combinations of how that gene leads to structuring inside the brain. And so some people are at significantly more risk of developing Alzheimer's disease if they have a certain genetic weighting. And so we've done research in our team and with collaborators to look and show that people who are perfectly healthy, there's nothing wrong with them, but they're just slightly a higher risk of Alzheimer's through the genetics, will tend to be a little bit less good at navigating. So they're not devastated, they're not terrible at navigating, they're just slightly less good at navigating. And that's kind of one direction that's been explored. Another one is to say, there's a team in Canada, Giuseppe Arias, the key lead scientist who's been working on this, who identified this condition called developmental topographical disorientation, so DTD. And it may be what you described. You said you're absolutely terrible at finding your way. Some of these
Yeah.
people, the typical definition of someone who would come under that category is they will have worked in a workplace for maybe 10 years, still can't get to their desk. Like they cannot just find their way inside the building to where their office is
Okay, I
because
definitely don't have that.
and it's most extreme, they get lost in their own house, which may only contain 5 rooms. Like they can't feel
Wow.
where they're constantly disoriented. So it could be quite debilitating, but it's not got us. This is not associated with some sort of traumatic brain differences that you can see on scans. So there may be some subtle differences, and they've identified some subtle differences between people who might have this condition. But going to your question about genetics, they found evidence that people who come forward with this condition of being really struggling to navigate are more likely to have another family member who identifies as having really significant navigational challenges, which suggests that that extreme end does tend to run in some genetic feature. But it's also worth noting that certainly within families, you can have people who are really terrible and also really quite good. So it is not it's not like there is a definitive gene that will give you good or bad navigation. Most genetics doesn't work in that way, that there's a gene for
Yeah.
being good at navigating. It's just weightings and loadings. So those are the kind of
Yeah.
interesting genetics, but it would be nice to see more work, but it's just challenging to do big genetic studies.
It's really interesting that you mentioned the APO Alzheimer's gene, because I actually did a 23andMe test a while ago, just for out of interest, and I actually do have one of those mutations that slightly, I think I have a 5% greater disposition to developing Alzheimer's when I'm 80, is how they laid it out in the statistics, at least in 23andMe. But I do actually have one of those mutated genes. So now I'm very curious if that actually plays any effect in my spatial navigation, because I had no idea there was any connection on those two. Because so I might have just learned something very interesting about myself, so I never knew that before.
Yeah, no, it's one of those things that's ongoing. So getting a large sample, really understanding it, I think is still a developing area. But 5% is not bad. And a lot of people are pointing out that your chance of developing Alzheimer's disease is heavily modified by lifestyle factors. How much like running triathlons, that's going to help, right? Avoid Alzheimer's. Sitting, driving a bus all day, or if you were just doing that and then more sitting, not so good. This is not. It's a risk factor. So yeah, there's good. There's good you can do in the world for that.
Yeah, for sure. Well, definitely one of the contributing factors in me deciding to do triathlon was one of that was that result. Amongst other things, it just makes me feel great anyway. So is there any health benefits to trying to actively improve our spatial navigation? I'm kind of curious, as the world develops, and as Google Maps has just been incredible for, like, I don't know, 10, 15 years, and I think I heavily rely on it, and that's probably a large reason why I haven't developed it. Are there health benefits to actually putting away the Google Maps and struggling your way around town for a while? What other benefits might that confer if you try and challenge that neural system, if you try and develop it?
Well, this is a great question. I think a lot of people would like to know the answer to that. And so far, I haven't seen any large, like, well-developed studies that have looked at that question in enough detail. I know there are groups who are very interested in that question, no doubt. But as far as I'm aware, we've not seen that kind of evidence come forward, just because it's very difficult to do that. So you've got to kind of take someone and change their lifestyle substantially. Like, a lot of people rely on Google Maps for getting around. So we don't know. But on the other hand, so another way of looking at this is to say we do know that keeping physically and mentally healthy, keeping them active, so keeping physically and mentally active is good for your, like, reducing all sorts of disease, including Alzheimer's disease. So it looks like it's important to take part in a number of things. So eat well. The kind of boring things you kind of say, eat well, exercise, all these things we're told that they are just, the evidence is there that's really good for not just for your physical health, but your brain health, which has become a bigger topic, brain health, in the last years. But and so with that idea that keeping yourself mentally active, that's exactly what turning off the GPS would do for you. And so in some sense, I would say if someone said, oh, one of the things I do is I like to go out and explore the natural world. I get out in forests and hills and get away. And I sometimes do it with friends, and we have a good laugh, and we go on a walk and we get good level of moderate exercise. And we have to really think about where we're going. That would tick a lot of boxes. Right. So not everyone can do those things because it takes time and you've got to have access to the natural world. But it does look like more and more, like, if you can get out to green space, it improves. If you can get active, it improves. If you're laughing with your friends and having social contact helps. And then that last bit of thinking for yourself does seem to be good. But all of these things, you might think about them a bit more like athletes optimizing to win the race. Like, they're not going to do 10% better just because they've got a new trainer. But they might get the edge with it. And so I think I think it's just an important thing to do, though, is to appreciate getting lost is not such a, if you've got the time, you take time to do these things. If you're not late to the doctors and you thought you'd try, but if as much as you can explore I think there are real benefits to you having the sense of control over your environment. And I personally like to see Google Maps provide more than just how to get from A to B as efficiently as possible. Could it teach you how to use the map system better? It'd be really great fun.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of games you could build into Google Maps that I think would be very fun. I know you said that the research doesn't directly say it just yet, but I am very curious if spatial navigation is one of those cognitive modules that seems to go awry and is an early detector in Alzheimer's. If you're every day challenging yourself by going out into different areas, and even as you age into your 60s and 70s, and you're really, flexing that muscle, I'm just super curious to know how that would affect the other symptoms of Alzheimer's.
Yeah, I mean, it stands to reason. It makes sense, but that's different from having the evidence. And it's just that having the evidence in this
Yes.
scenario is a big, big challenge. I think somebody's going to get there and show something like this. Um, but it's one of those things where just because there's evidence isn't there doesn't mean you shouldn't be doing it. It's like it logically makes sense in the same way that keeping yourself physically active makes sense. Trying to think for yourself, it's also where thinking, phones can die. You might run out of signal. Like, having your independence and your capacity to find your way is potentially life saving. There are people who've lost their way, didn't really learn how to navigate. There are terrible stories of people who didn't, find their way back to if they went out paddling and a fog came in, just never really thought about their bearings and where they were. And then just they're meters away from safety, but they are not clued into their environment, and then they're going to pass out, not make it. So it can have some life-changing effects, but more like you're saying, the health effects are likely there. So it's certainly something I do. I like to try and, take different routes and think about could I take a shortcut through here? How is this related? Where am I going? But that's just me. I've sat looking at the literature for a while.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's one of the things that I'm comfortable believing, even if there isn't direct research applying its efficacy, that just using your brain in new, novel ways can never be bad. Just challenging your brain to do different things than it doesn't do on a regular basis, that at least can't be negative, at least. Learn a new language, play music, do these things, just challenge your brain to link up and connect and do things it doesn't usually do. I think that's in general a pretty good takeaway. So last question. I love to ask everyone this. So what are you most excited about in the next decade in neuroscience and technology? And then the inverse to that question is, what are you most scared of in the next decade in anything related to neuroscience, technology, and society?
Okay, I've got very clear answers to those. I'll maybe start with the bad one, maybe to
Good.
the good one. The bad one, I think, the neuroscience, and I'm not so sure it's what we're starting to see. If you look at the Ukraine war, is the deployment of automated drones. So these are drones, launched off-site into the battle zone, where there's a lot of jamming going on, so you can't control it with a remote control. So it's not a human-operated drone anymore. It's a neural network running a drone that is delivering a payload to destroy an infrastructure setting and likely killing people. And without that, Ukraine are trying to defend themselves from that. That would be most people's perspective in the West, I assume. But so they're taking all options they can. But I think there's an escalation here in like what's happened with like the way in which we can run. It's a natural progression, but it's just a bit. I think one of the scary things that's happening in the world is automated drones that are running on systems, and I would expect a lot more
You don't have to
regulation.
convince me. I mean, yeah, that's terrifying. Not many people have
Yeah,
just instantly been like AI automated drones. I'm like, yeah, you're right. That's terrifying.
precisely. So that is the terrifying one. That's linked to neuroscience because they're running neural networks to automate. They're building on ideas from neuroscience to make that. So what's maybe helpful on the other side of that, and the positive, I think, is that in this day and age, we're now able to simulate whole environments. So there are facilities, at University College London where I work, where we can mock up an entire hospital ward and record people in it and modify it and rerun experiments with lots of wearables. So wearables tech is becoming really interesting in terms of being able to do lots of health monitoring, but it's great for kind of understanding ourselves and scientifically monitoring. So I think there's some huge, exciting, potential out there to understand how the environment can be designed better for humans, like to really get the best out of what we want in the world around us. And we just didn't have the facilities to do that. And it's a wonderful, for me, kind of combination of lots of disciplines coming together. I get excited when you get this real cross or transdisciplinary kind of approach. So in that new area of development, you've got people interested in building design, working with wearables, tech people interested in heart rate monitoring, working with neuroscientists, people working with crowd modeling, evacuation teams, all coming together to kind of solve problems around how can we best make a world that really facilitates and saves human life. So that is where I'm most excited about, where a lot of the lab research can come out now and into the field and help us.
Amazing. Dr. Hugo Spiers, thank you so much. This has been an absolute pleasure and a really enjoyable conversation. I've personally learned a lot, both about myself and the neural mechanisms that we all share. So I really appreciate that. I think it's all fascinating. Thanks so much.
That's a pleasure talking to you, Evan. Yeah, thank you.